Okay, David. So you became a racecourse regular in a professional, or at least a part-time professional capacity, as a starting price reporter.
Yeah. Well, we'd met Neil Wilkins, who was one of the, well, at the time he was the junior man for the Sporting Chronicle. The Chron and the Life each had to produce a neutral representative at the race meetings to return the starting prices. And Neil was one of the main men. He was a younger lad then, and my pal played football for Luton Town, Peter Anderson, and there were one or two Chelsea players that we'd got together and had a chat. And I got to know Neil quite frequently because he lived down near Slough, and I'd chatted. I was very interested in the system, and I chatted to him, and suddenly he sprung on me. He said, "We've got nobody to work at Kempton Park on Thursday night." He said, "You know the job now. Could you fill in for us?" Because the night meetings were proliferating, and they were short of staff um, to work the meetings. So he did actually write out all the bets, 100-7, 100-6, and
All the
so
fractions.
on, and with the fractions, yeah. And so I stepped in and seemed to go quite well, and so I thought, well, this is quite interesting. It earns a few quid at a night meeting. And then it came to Easter, when there were about 12, 13 meetings, and I was on my own at Plumpton, and a jumps meeting. And there was a 2-horse race. Albert Davison's Minitab was one of them. I've forgotten the name of the other. But they were betting. You can imagine how the ring was in a bit of, there were 5-6, 10-11. I'll give even, 10-11, 5-6, tips on. And by the end of the race, it was, all the prices I could see were 6-5 on each of two. And Neil had said, "Now don't you haven't to guess any. You have to report what you see." So I reported this race as 6-5 on each of two, and then I suddenly started getting punters hammering me, serious punters. You can't. There's no favourite. You've got to name a favourite. You see. I said, "Well, what was favourite?" "Oh, well, you could have made one of them. One." Well, there was a lot of chuntering about it, and that sort of really started off one or two discussions, but we never came to much of a conclusion about that one. It had to be 6-5 on, and all bets on on named favourite were void. But I didn't know. Sorry, I didn't know that at the time. But so one or two bits and pieces along the way I picked up, and a couple of bookmakers tried to bribe me to.
Yeah, no, that was interesting because I couldn't think how it would benefit an on-course bookie to bribe an SP return.
Well, it was Jackie Cohen, and he was pretty drunk most of the time, and he used to say, "What would it cost me for you to return the price that I tell you?" Well, I said, "Jack," he said, "Come on, have a whiskey." Well, I said, "No." I said, "You can buy me a cup of tea sometime, but I won't be playing any games."
Now, there was other characters.
Well, there was...
Michael Tabor was...
Michael Tabor was, yes, he came into the picture in the late 70s. And he was always arguing. He was a feisty guy. He'd be on the rails, but he was betting as much as laying. And he was always arguing. Dave Richardson occasionally had up and downers with him. And there's one day at Plumpton again when I was working with Mick Bass, and it was pretty quiet, and he was shouting, he was arguing with somebody, and he suddenly went mad and took on a 14-1 outsider and went round the ring and smashed it off all the boards. It was just on a whim, I think, rather than he fancied anything. It was a novice chase, and by the time he'd finished and the time they were off, they'd all wiped the price off the boards. So there wasn't a price.
Off the boards.
It was backed off the boards by Michael Tabor, and so Mick Bass, he sort of hummed and hawed, and I said, well, there's no price, but we've got to return something. So anyway, we hit on the idea, which I think was the last price that was actually laid in the ring, something like 5-2. But that caused a bit of a problem. That, you know, a lot of people had different views about that. But that was Michael Tabor, and then
it was a very strong ring in those days, wasn't it?
It was. There was a strong ring. Yes, there were people like Dougie Goldstein and Tabor, and well, Leslie White for.
And Barney Curley was somebody that used to.
Well, he didn't. I didn't come across him very much. He did till that he had a bet with Corals, I think 100,000 to 10,000, that he would train 10 winners before Christmas, and that's when I used to come across him at Fonkwell and Plumpton, where he was putting horses in cellars that were a little too good for cellars, and he was getting taken, well, not to the cleaners, but people were coming in and bidding for his horses when they didn't want him. They didn't want the horse, particularly at Fonkwell and at Plumpton, where Isaac, what was the man's name? The chairman of Plumpton, Kerman, Mr. Kerman, and Andy was involved at Fonkwell. Well, at Fonkwell one day, he was nearing his 10 runners, and he ran this horse, and it won by 6 or 7 lengths. And Kerman had an American lady down in his box. She used to come from America regularly, and she had a couple of horses here, and he took her down to the bidding, and she bid Curly up to about 8,500 quid for this horse. And so Curly wanted to keep it. He had another plan for it, and he had to pay 8,500. Well, he went to Kerman's box and then said to Mrs. whatever she was called, "Madam, you can have him for 5 grand. Just give me 5 grand and he's yours." Well, she wouldn't pay him. She wouldn't pay him. So it was quite clear she was just being just acting on Kerman's instructions, and there was always somebody there that knew the clerk of the course at Fonkwell. I think he owned a big department store at Brighton, and if they ever got stuck with a horse, he would take it, you know, he would, but not for much.
Now there's a guy called Ted Gladson.
Oh, and then, well, Ted Gladson was a guy that came over from America. That well, he came to one of these gambling junkets that they used to arrange, and between the Victoria Sporting Club and the Royal Lancaster Hotel. And I happened to meet him at the Sporting Club, where there were people from Chicago and others from Florida, Chicago and Tampa. And my pal Peter Anderson was playing for Tampa Bay Rowdies at the time, and he happened to be over, and so we were in the club having a meal, and somebody recognised Peter. We all got together, and then they decided they would come to Kempton with us the next afternoon. And this guy was had plenty to say, and he said, "Oh, we'll come. I'll be there." And anyway, we met them off the train at Kempton. Sorry. And first race, Frankham was on again. Frankham was on something that was a bit tasty, and I got 7-2 for. They were giving me 30s and 40s and 50s, so I had 7-2 to about 300 quid. And this guy went off, Gladson, and he knew better. He didn't want 30 or 40, he wanted £1,000 on it. See? So he's gone to the tote and put his £1,000 on the tote. First race at Kempton on a Tuesday afternoon, and the sort of 3-to-1 chance paid odds on the tote, and he was the butt of all the other gamblers because he collected about 600 quid for his ground, where they'd actually got the proper odds. So we had to calm him down. And then he latched on to me, and we were going to Newbury at the weekend, and he stayed on and came to Newbury, and we linked up like that. But he was a gambler, and a big time.
And Peter O'Sullivan was a big gambler.
Peter O'Sullivan was
a successful gambler.
Yeah, quite successful. But Ted Gladson, he came over for Royal Ascot, and I had to be sure I was trying to control him, and I got him an account with Ladbrokes, and I asked Gladson's wife, how much. She said about £10,000. So I got him an account for 10 grand with Ladbrokes, and the first day he disappeared. I lost him, and at the end of the day he was quite white-faced, and Derek Smith of Ladbrokes called me over and said, "Your man, he's 9,000 down on the first day." He said if he gets to 10 he's got to pay. He can't keep betting above 10. So I told him this, and oh dear. Anyway, next day there was a major holiday horse in the first race that everybody seemed to fancy. It was about 100 to 30. He managed to get £2,000 on it, around about 7-2. So that put him back in the business. And by the end of the week, well, we'd had one very successful day. We met up with the big Irish gambler, O'Sullivan, Frank O'Sullivan. I'm never sure whether it was O'Sullivan or Sullivan, and he knew the inside of Vincent O'Brien's yard, and we had a big tip for a horse that Carson was riding called April Silk, and it was in a big handicap, and it was 8-9 to 1. Well, I fancied another horse in the race, so I backed it and did a reverse forecast, and they were first and second. You couldn't see the horse a furlong out. It was Carson. He was buried amongst the mass. Then all of a sudden it opened up like the Sea of Galilee, and head down whirlwind finish from Carson. And this guy had won 120 grand, O'Sullivan, on the horse. And we were having a party here that night. It was my birthdays always tended to land in Ascot week. And he came down here, and he by the end of the week he won 190,000 quid on the week. And we were having another Irish fella down here was telling all the ladies he was the Bishop of Virginia Water, and it was just a crazy night. But anyway, the sad story about that was that O'Sullivan went back to Ireland, and he wanted to buy a stud for $250,000, and they were telling him, well, get the mortgage for the rest. You've got the. Of course, he went to. He said, I'll get it at Galway next week. Of course, he blew most of it there. Gladson went over to Ireland for the Irish Derby. He met 2 Irish friends of mine, invited him over, and Cecil from Ladbrokes, there's a guy called
remember Cecil, yeah.
He said, "Oh, I'll get him credit with Sean,
Graham.
the Irish bookie." So he's gone over to Ireland on the Wednesday, and we were going over for the Irish Derby on the Friday, 4 of us. Well, by the time I got there on the Friday, he wasn't in good shape, and by the Saturday, the Irish Derby, he'd gone 20 grand down to Sean Graham, and they were telling him what a man Sean could be. He sent people to America to collect the money, and O'Sullivan suggested, tell him you didn't know about the currency, and you were betting in dollars. And I'm thinking, well, if he pays, I said 5,000. If he pays $10,000, at least I'll be off the hook. And he did in the end. But O'Sullivan was saying, tell him you were betting in lira. So that was my contact with the 2 gamblers of sorts.